For a second, imagine. It's February and you're in the 5th grade. On Tuesday morning at 8 a.m. sharp, you're there in the school parking lot, surrounded by all your friends and peers. You're about to leave on a 4-day ski trip with school. And through all the anticipation and craze, you brush off your mother on the way to the bus in order to make it onto it first with all your friends. This was me on the 16th of February, 2019. 2 days later, my mother's carotid artery dissection led to her suffering a stroke at the age of 46. Due to the school trip, I was blissfully unaware until it happened. In fact, the first warning signs which went off in my head weren't until the Friday when I returned home from school, and it was my father who picked me up in place of my mother. It wasn't until later where my siblings and I were sat down and faced with the truth that our family of 5 was split, with my mother in and out of the operating theatre. This event remains my family's tragedy, and it's shaped our lives for the past 5 years. This has also been my main exposure to tragedy. With a quick Google search, one can define tragedy as an event causing great suffering, destruction, pain, and distress. Yet, I believe the true meaning to be a bit deeper than just a few words strung together. I believe that there's an element of uniqueness in our suffering. We each have our own problems and mechanisms to cope. The act of overcoming our trauma is both distinctive and sensitive. Thus, I want to generate a train of thought which offers us the platform to reflect on the systems we have in place to deal with our trauma. I have a strong belief that every form of tragedy is unique. Everyone suffers from something different, and it's important to consider this without undermining the strength of our own feelings. In a world of 8 billion people, I'm sure there are millions who have suffered far worse than me. For example, in a similar case to my mother, a friend of my father's suffered from a stroke recently. Unfortunately, dissimilar to my mother, he could not overcome the circumstances he was faced with, which unfortunately resulted in him taking his own life. Although many of us will not experience such a large form of tragedy in our lifetime, in today's world, we face micro and macro forms of tragedy on almost a daily basis. For example, I find my favorite football team's performance this season an utter tragedy. The team I support, Ajax, following a disappointing season last season, won only 2 of their first 10 league games in the league this year. Perhaps not the strongest example when covering such a serious topic, but I just wanted to throw it out there. All in all, studies have shown that up to 50% of people who are directly impacted by a disaster will develop a mental health issue. In order to address this mental health epidemic, the systems we have in place to cope with our trauma need to be improved. The usual tip given to someone who's been through a tragic event is to talk to someone. I'm sure everyone in attendance has heard this simple piece of advice before. If I, for one, as a teenager, had a penny for every time someone suggested I speak to a trusted teacher, adult, friend, counselor, or any other form of trusted person, I'd be a very wealthy young man. Yet, the likelihood of me going through with this piece of advice is reasonably unlikely, and this is unfortunately a mindset reflected in society as a whole. And between you, me, and everyone listening, this is a major problem, as in an age where communication is more accessible than ever, we fail to capitalize on this. As human interaction is proven to boost both our physical and mental well-being, we as a species thrive off of interaction. Connecting with people can boost our mental health through reducing stress, anxiety, and depression. All of this is fundamental to coping with and eventually overcoming our trauma. Thus, by beginning one conversation a day, regardless of the topic, we can further develop our connection with others, while simultaneously, hopefully, building up the strength which can lead to us overcoming our trauma. Moving on, the range of harmful implications of tragedy in adults and children alike is plentiful. Thus, how do we mitigate this? I want to emphasize the importance of having a strong support system. The proper state, it takes a village, and this is no understatement, as it's the things we carry which make us strong, but the people around us which emphasize this. Speaking from the perspective of someone close to a suffering individual, I'd like to discuss the nuances of offering help. Accepting assistance when vulnerable is daunting and, quite frankly, embarrassing. I've learned that there's a fine line between gently offering support and overwhelming the person in need. Since shortly after my mother's stroke, my twin sister and I were approached by our two fifth-grade teachers who reassured us that we had their wholehearted support. This simple gesture left me instilled with confidence and created a lasting admiration for both teachers, creating a lasting impact. However, a different experience unfolded when I was approached by our school counselor. As when approached, she probed me with daunting questions about my mother's health, as well as my own mental well-being. This interaction left me overwhelmed. Thus, I advocate for finding balance in offering support, as offering support in such pressing situations can be the difference maker, but it can also leave the person in need feeling further isolated. Leading on, I would like to discuss how to build a recovery. To start, let's define the recovery. Dr. Gabor Mate, a Canadian physician, states that according to him, recovery is the process of finding yourself. To him, it's also important to note that through any experience, you don't fully lose yourself, as recovery is the process of getting something back. Thus, what you're finding has never been fully lost nor destroyed. When someone experiences disaster, the body's reaction is to seek refuge through feel-good chemicals in order to create short-term relief. This is, of course, through the release of dopamine, which works by spreading across select areas of your brain to create feelings of pleasure and satisfaction. It is natural instinct to seek these desirable feelings, yet the method of which we obtain them is extremely important. Succeeding a tragic event, we often turn to drug abuse. This is due to the effective short-term dopamine rush produced by certain substances. Naturally, our body will start to crave these substances which give it the reaction it desires, which, as we know, substance abuse leads to a plethora of long-term negative effects. And the absurd thing in all of this is that the same high levels of dopamine and the rush it produces can be achieved through other more healthy activities, such as getting enough sleep, meditation, and exercise. And this is all backed by health professionals. Yet, I can think of an even further long-term solution to all this, which is accessible to all of us. And this is through pursuing something we're passionate about. We all have our unique sets of passions, and pursuing them releases the same high levels of dopamine, and also helps us stay more motivated and goal-focused. And on top of that, it also gives us a sense of self-worth and purpose. And each of these qualities are imperative to staging a recovery and eventually, hopefully, overcoming our trauma. And linking this all back to my lovely mother, she is a prime example of this, as through linking her passions of writing and running, she was able to make such swift progress in her stroke recovery, as she was able to pair them with both her verbal therapy and physiotherapy. Finally, in weight of everything I've covered, I strongly believe that we as a society lead oftentimes unfulfilled and sometimes even shortened lives due to our trauma. Up to 50% of people who live with trauma will develop mental illness. This is frightening. Reflecting on this epidemic, we should look to improve the systems we have in place to deal with our trauma. I push for the development of our communication as well as the pursuit of our passions in order to stage a recovery, but further work is still imperative. The only solution I see is us coming together as a society to address the hidden issue impacting us all. Thank you for all your kind attention, and please have a lovely evening.